from like a somatic lens is that trauma also shows up in our body in different capacities, right? And I think if we look at, there's been some studies done on like individuals who have higher ACE scores will have higher heart rates, and different physiological responses to trauma. And so I think that if we're able to acknowledge that and look at like, okay, and I'm going to just use an example of like experiencing anxiety. When I'm starting to experience anxiety, I notice that my hands start to get clammy, or I start to feel it in my stomach. And there is often those physiological warning signs beforehand that we might not traditionally notice. But if we're able to notice them before it kind of turns into a panic attack or turns into an elevated emotional or mental health response, then that can be really beneficial. And so I think that really getting in touch with our bodies is really important for trauma recovery and for trauma healing.
Welcome to Truehope Cast, the official podcast of Truehope Canada. I am your host, Simon Brazier. At Truehope Cast, we explore the many physiological and psychological dimensions of mental health, seeking to provide motivation, inspiration, knowledge, and practical solutions for living well in a beautiful but sometimes wild world. Today's guest is Stephanie McAlister. She is a counsellor, researcher, and entrepreneur who is passionate about making professional mental health care more accessible to Canadians. She is the founder of Virtual Connect Counselling Clinic, a Canada-wide practice helping individuals and couples receive support from the comfort of their very own homes. We explore the growing understanding that mental health is never just psychological. Healing the mind requires supporting the whole person, including the brain and the body, and we'll discuss how therapy, lifestyle, and proper nutrition can help work together to support lasting recovery. Stephanie brings wisdom, compassion, and practical insights that I know you'll find encouraging and empowering. Here is my conversation with Stephanie McAlister. Enjoy the show. Stephanie, hi, welcome to Truehope Cast. How are you? What is going well?
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I am doing very well. Happy to be on the show.
Excellent. Yeah, we just chatted before. I'm in Kamloops. You're in Vancouver. That's like only a few hours away. So it's not often we get to have someone local on the call, which is, really, really good. So yeah, thank you again for being here. We're going to be discussing healing beyond talk, trauma, nutrition, and the future of mental health today. But before we jump into that, can you let us know a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Stephanie McAlister, and kind of live in two worlds. I am a clinical psychotherapist and the owner of Virtual Connect Counselling Clinic. And so I run the practice, and then I also do some counseling. I've spent a lot of my career in trauma therapy and trauma work. And then in my other world, I have done quite a bit of research in the realm of addictions, working on prevention projects, as well as working on detox and recovery centers. So kind of lived in the clinical world, both in research and in actual practice.
Amazing. Great intro. Love it. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, some different areas, which is really, really cool. Just like as a side, what is there a particular passion that comes from like a life experience or a loved one? Like I feel like so many amazing people, practitioners we have on the show, their passion, their drive, their career stems from, something happening in their lives, and they're going out there trying to benefit the world.
Yeah, I think a combination of a couple things. I was one of those really weird people who in like grade 7, I vividly remember being like, I want to be a counselor. So I kind of just always knew. And then I have had a lot of people kind of in my personal life who've struggled with addictions, and just seeing the implications of that. And then throughout my undergrad and then following that, kind of got into the world of addictions research, and then obviously also brought that over into the clinical world as well. So that's kind of how that all came to be. Yeah.
Let's talk about healing beyond, just talking. We've had, I said to you before we went live here that we've had so many amazing different types of therapists on the show. We have so many options for people to be able to connect and be supported by somebody to help them out. It's just amazing. But kind of for decades, mental health treatment is really primarily focused on thoughts, emotions, and behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Why Why do you think we're beginning to recognize that healing often needs to go beyond just talking alone and addressing the whole person, the mind and body?
Well, I think that one of the biggest things is from like a somatic lens is that trauma also shows up in our body in different capacities, right? And I think if we look at, there's been some studies done on like individuals who have higher ACE scores will have higher heart rates and different physiological responses to trauma. And so I think that if we're able to acknowledge that and look at like, okay, and I'm going to just use an example of like experiencing anxiety. When I'm starting to experience anxiety, I notice that my hands start to get clammy or I start to feel it in my stomach. And there is often those physiological warning signs beforehand that we might not traditionally notice. But if we're able to notice them before it kind of turns into a panic attack or turns into an elevated emotional or mental health response, then that can be really beneficial. And so I think that really getting in touch with our bodies is really important for trauma recovery and for trauma healing.
That's an interesting point you just made there. Becoming, in touch with with our bodies. Do you think that just our current culture makes that more of a challenge? Uh, I've had the conversation with a few people on the show where I feel like we've lost this sense, this ability to know our bodies a little bit better. I think that in traditional cultures, dance, breath work, like all these types of things would have been actual traditional methodologies that we would have had like as tools in our tool chest to deal with situations when they come up. Do you agree with that? Is there any like research on that? Do you think we've maybe like lost a little bit of our ability to, let's say, self-regulate or deal with the traumatic things that happens to us?
I don't know. I can't like think of a specific research study, so I won't quote anything there. But I will say I think that as we like just zoom out from our general society, like we live in such a fast-paced environment now, right? Like with access to social media, having the entire internet in the palm of our hands and a phone at all times. And I think there's always a distraction and
Mm.
there's always something to pay attention to. There's always something that's grabbing our attention. And that's, in my opinion, grabbing away from maybe that like focus of what's actually happening within my body. And if I am to stop and like you said, like do some breath work, maybe I'll notice that like, oh, my back's really tense and I didn't notice that before. Why is that? Is that
Mm.
physiological response? Is there an emotional part to that? So yeah, I can't necessarily quote a research study, but I definitely would say that we live in such a fast-paced society that it has moved us away from the very general expression of stop and smell the roses.
Yeah, yeah, nice. Yeah. Well, I just, obviously, I can't imagine what it was like to live 20,000 years ago, but living now, just with everything that we have, especially in like big cities, you're in Vancouver, which is a big city. I'm from London, which is a monstrous city. And you can't not like feel the energy, the stress, the anxiety that everyone's in to like go, go, go and get things done. And that cultural evolution that we do have in big cities, smaller cities, even, towns, etc. That's not really how our physiology has evolved, like biologically speaking, in regards to like being responding to stress. I think our biology is designed to deal with stress in very acute short phases and bursts, but it's having to be engaged in like really long periods of time, and that's not something yet that our biological evolution has really caught up with yet. What do you think?
I do agree, and I think that the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is distraction, and the
Mm.
whole, like, when you live in that hustle and bustle and constantly moving and, you have distractions, and
Mm.
so it's more of an intentional time to reconnect with our bodies. I think that's what you're referencing as opposed to, yeah, big cities. There's a lot of movement, a lot going on.
Yeah. And when we do take the time to, get out of the city and get skiing or go camping or even just like going for a hike or a walk with a loved one or the dog, I feel like it's the really quite amazing thing that we're able to do. But that would have been the absolute norm every single day from waking up to going to bed. And that's how the environment has help dictate our biology and vice versa. So yeah, it's just an interesting thing that we really have to be conscious and aware and put the time in and be dedicated to helping our minds, helping our bodies with our behaviors to get them in a place where we can restore, replenish, and maybe deal with some of the things that happen to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you said that. So I'm originally from Ontario, and I will give BC a lot of credit that you can go out and go on a hike and go skiing or go on a camping trip in a different way. And I do think that that really helps to connect with your body and connect in like a grounding way.
Yeah, I think the environment in which we grow up in is super interesting because I'm from the UK, and you have to go to you have to go off that island into Europe to find a hill that
Yeah.
isn't like 50 feet, more than 50 feet tall. And I find that's interesting because it's just like flat cities everywhere. You just go from town to town, and to be in the awe of nature is quite a challenge for a lot of those places. Like, the England is 52, 54 million people. That's nearly twice the population of Canada. And it's like, where are you supposed to go to find solace and calm and in a lot of these countries? So it's a real challenge for a lot of people, but we certainly do have options. I think as you get older, you recognize that, just like we need to try and eat as best as we can. We need to try and move our bodies as best as we can. We need to literally put our physical body in a place of nature to help just recalibrate and finally rest our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And to create the time for that, I think it's like you said, it's not something that is just going to be handed to you. You kind of have to carve out that space.
Mm. Yeah, it's a commitment, just like anything else. Absolutely. So, there's always ways around those things. I want to talk about trauma, like living in the body and what that means. And I've got like a scripted question here that I thought up when I was looking at your website and your work. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think in regards to where is our trauma response primed? And there's obviously many factors to that, and it's probably a massive question. But I don't know if you're able to narrow that down a little bit. I'd love to be able to understand from you're way more experienced in this than I am, but yeah, like that trauma response that we all have, that all seems to be very unique and different. Where does it originally become primed?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And as you're asking, I think of like three answers immediately. So yeah, it's a broad one. But first and foremost, I always like to say that any reaction to trauma is a normal reaction because it's a reaction to an abnormal experience, right? And I think we sometimes have this feeling of like, oh, well, is this a normal response or is this a regular reaction to this? And I just kind of want for listeners to hear like any reaction to a traumatic event is a normal response because your body is reacting to something that is abnormal. And I think from more of a clinical standpoint, there is the categories, right? Like there's people who react in the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. And that's either obviously fight is like you're going to kind of confront the situation, confront the issue, you freeze, you kind of clam up, don't really know what to do. Fawn kind of goes into the category of people pleasing, right? A flight, and then a flight is obviously kind of running or fleeing the situation. And so I think that those would be categorized as like our physiological responses to trauma, depending on the person. And like I said, I do think that each person experiences trauma differently. And in their reaction, those are kind of the four areas that are most common. And then the third thing that came to mind for me, and this is a lot more of like an individualistic perspective to trauma, and that is that depending on the events that have happened, sometimes we feel trauma in our body related to that event. And so what I mean by that is, let's say you were in a really traumatic car accident and you felt it in your arm. And then when we're discussing that traumatic situation, you feel it in your arm. And that's because that's where the experience took place for you. And so I think that to answer your question, I think there's a lot of areas, but I also do think that there is a specific to the event that took place. I've noticed that just in working with people over the years that sometimes they'll feel things where it happened for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you said the reaction to an abnormal event. I'd love to explore that a little bit because, for my friend John, for just making a name up, his abnormal event his event that he could react to would be something that, I wouldn't consider to be like abnormal, for example. So what do you mean by like abnormal and also for like a lot of people, maybe previously in their life, what like causes them to have a big reaction now is abnormal, but before they didn't have a reaction to it. So like what would have changed there?
Yeah. And I think that in relation to this, it's also trauma comes from a place of the narrative that we tell ourselves, right? And I think to what your point is that some people are going to react one way and other people are not going to have a reaction at all. The narrative that we tell ourselves, what we make of a situation is more important than any event, right? If somebody, and I'm going to use, I always like to go back to a car accident because it's kind of a very common trauma and kind of known about. But let's say if you and I were in the same car accident, and for me, I told myself like, oh my God, like I think my life was ending. Like I thought I was going to die. And you were like, oh, like I realized that it was just going to be a fender bender and we were going to walk away. I'm going to have probably a much higher trauma response to that because the threat that I perceived was significantly higher. And I think that that is in and of itself a really important feature of how we understand and interpret trauma is what did we tell ourselves about the event? What did the event mean to us? What was the symbol? And that creates more of a trauma response than kind of anything else, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. I think that because what I try and do is try and hold myself with as much empathy and understanding for people at any point ever, even if there's someone driving horrifically. I kind of try and imagine that it's my like grandma or my some friend's grandma in the front seat to just like kind of chill myself out. But I think that that's no, to recognize when somebody is struggling from something I wouldn't react to, or I would just try and maybe like just pull my socks up or something, like recognizing that their life experience is going to be like viciously different than mine. And you mentioned about like what did that event mean? You know, obviously that, you know, the event happens and then from there there's going to be thoughts, emotions, behaviors that probably rise up for like many weeks or even months or even years for people. And I wonder what the brain does and the body does in a trauma response like that, depending on the circumstances that you're actually in, like pre-event. So like, you know, if I'm driving and I'm really like anxious about like all this stuff that's going on, and my buddy next door, my buddy in the passenger seat is just like sitting there chilling to music, doesn't have a care in the world, and we both have this accident. I wonder what because I was already in like a prime stress response, what that would do to the future of that situation. Plus, I'm driving as well. Like, you know, I'm kind of responsible for that other person. You think like what I could have done. Is this my fault? These are all things that obviously come up. But do you know what I mean in regards to like where am I in my life and world when this like bad thing happens, and how that will guide my experience post event?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing in what you said there that I think is really important is there something I could have done different? What was my role in this? And I think that in and of itself, the ownership that we take over events can be really hard, right? Like if you've been in a situation where it's like, oh, like what else could I have done? Right. And feeling that sense of a lack of control is also really hard, right? Like it's like, oh, if I had swerved this way, then maybe me and my friend wouldn't have been in this scenario, right? And the level of responsibility, and then also our ability to cope and deal with things, right? Like if you're already in a state where you're feeling really, really anxious, a car accident, ironically, might actually just kind of be like, oh, just another thing to add to the list, as opposed to somebody who's feeling calm and then has this big event take place, which is kind of an interesting flip and maybe not what is often perceived. But yeah, that would be something to consider.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors. It's like, you know, how did your parents deal with bad situations? That's certainly going to have an impact when you're younger and you're kind of unconscious to the idea of dealing with bad things. And the schools we're in, the school we're in, our friend groups, like all of these things that I guess probably have like different factors. So that's why, you know, it's so complex in regards to like, you know, what is that individual going through and what's the brain telling them, and yeah, we could go on forever about that. Like that's why we barely know anything about the brain, right? You know, like it's this super unbelievable complex thing that we barely know anything of, and you know, within like 10 years what we do know is not right, and all these things. So yeah, it's what can we use right now to kind of help and support people is obviously really, really important. But I want to talk about EMDR and reprocessing trauma. So yeah, EMDR has become, one of the most talked about therapies for trauma, I'd say. Can you explain a little bit more about like how it works, why it can help people move beyond experiences that have, maybe kept people stuck for years, sometimes even decades?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love your comments about the brain. It's the irony in the fact that the brain doesn't understand the brain. Um, but when it comes to EMDR, I will say it's a very scripted form of counseling, and it's very connected to, so the way I would explain EMDR to clients starting out is that when we experience a traumatic event, it's stored in one memory network of the brain, and the ability to process that is stored in another memory network of the brain. And through EMDR, we work to connect those two kind of parts of the brain and process it. And that's done through what's referred to as like bilateral stimulation, either visually, auditory, or through physical, the sensation of tapping, hearing, or seeing kind of like a light bar go across your eyes. Now, with EMDR, the goal is to kind of, I don't want to say make sense of, but make sense of an event and process it and be able to put it to rest. You're not going to forget the event. I have had some clients who've come in and are fearful that like, oh, if I go through this, am I going to forget that this ever happened? You're not going to forget it, but you're able to make sense of it and almost put it to rest in a different way. I have found that EMDR works for quite a few people. It's helpful in when we experience a traumatic situation. There's a lot of like triggers and flashbacks and those kind of things that come up that often impact people. And through the processing of EMDR, we're able to kind of make sense of the event, understand it, a lot of the times recognize, yeah, this wasn't my fault. And put it to rest. Does that answer? Do you have any questions about EMDR?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, just for people, what EMDR stands for, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And just what you said, I'd love to just clarify, just so I understand. So the memory of an event is stored in a different part of the brain to the area in which you would process the event. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Super interesting. And is that like left part of the brain and right part of the brain, front, back? Is it far away? Because I wonder, like, is there a deliberate reason that they're so far away and they're separated? Because if you were to try and do both of those things in the same part of the brain, that could be really troublesome if you were, 20,000 years ago and trying to get away from a tiger.
Yeah. So I actually don't know the specifics of the brain anatomy, so I don't want to comment on that as it relates to EMDR. But I think the idea is that, interesting that you brought up the tiger, is that like our fight, flight, freeze response, right? I go back to kind of what I said at the beginning with it's a reaction to an abnormal event, and we don't know how to process it like kind of a normal memory, right? Like, okay, we're going to remember this podcast after, provided nothing traumatic happens into it, and it's just going to go into our memory network and that'll be the end of it, right? Whereas when you've been exposed to, I'll go back to our car accident example, a car accident, you might have not fully processed that, or you might not be able to kind of quote unquote put that into like a memory network because you constantly have those triggers and those flashbacks and those moments. And like you said, like, okay, could I have done something different? Whereas through EMDR, the goal is to work on kind of, okay, no, I did the best that I could. The event's over, and let's store this in the memory network the same way that we would store kind of non-traumatic memories.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, that makes sense that, we have this podcast for an hour, and the way that my brain would process that to like, we do this for an hour, and then like the bathtub falls through the roof here.
Yeah.
And falls close to me, right? Like that would be a very, very different situation. Yeah, that's cool. I like that. Great answer. Bravo. That was a complex question. I was just thinking about the different areas of the brain and why that happens and why they're there. I don't know too much.
Yeah, that's very fair.
I don't think anyone could have answered that question any better. So bravo to you. That's awesome. Let's talk about addiction, trauma, and the brain. You've mentioned that addiction and trauma and detox, and these things are big passions of yours. So you've worked, I think, extensively in addiction research and counseling. So how often do you find that trauma is at the root of substance abuse? And what role does restoring brain and body health play in long-term recovery?
Yeah, so I think that I'm gonna speak to the side of like trauma and addictions really kind of being overlapped, but I do want to make a note for you and for listeners that just because, or sorry, I do want to make a note for you and the listeners that you don't need to experience a traumatic experience in order to struggle with an addiction, and that it is a separate situation, and it's not that they have to be paired. But I
Mm,
do think that when there is the relationship, it is helpful to address the traumatic situation as well as the substance use, right? And I think a lot of the time when you see those things overlap, it's connected to a coping mechanism.
uh-huh.
And so from like a clinical standpoint, okay, we're trying to, and I also like to point out that everybody's goals through recovery is different. And I think we all kind of assume abstinence is always the goal, but it isn't for everybody. But assuming that somebody wanted an abstinence and not to use any substances, I would take it from the standpoint of, okay, what are your triggers? What are the things that have led you to use? And how can we replace that with coping mechanisms that are more beneficial? And I also think lifestyle, create doing things constantly to put ourselves in a place where we're feeling mentally well, we're feeling better about ourselves, where we don't feel like we need to kind of use substances as a means of coping. And that's a lot easier said than done. But I do think that that's another part. I always like to say, like, you're not going to practice a fire drill in the middle of a fire. And so making sure that you're kind of creating a lifestyle the best that you can where you are filling your cup in simplistic terms.
Amazing. Yeah, filling the cup is a huge, beautiful term. I love that. I'd love to get your input on like your education, your experience, your circles of therapy that, whether we have a trauma, be that physical or psychological, and the body is either it could be very physically damaged from a car accident, for example, or a concussion. And then you have a psychological trauma or a stress that, your body is going into a sympathetic
Mhm,
fight or flight response where your requirement for nutrients
mhm,
ramps up, right? Like, you hurt yourself, your body's got to deal with that physical trauma. And, if you are constantly in a stress state because of a psychological trauma as well, your requirement for specific nutrients just like ramps up because your body's in this like go, go, go state.
mhm,
What's the talk around those types of traumas that lead into like nutritional deficiencies because your body is like your body is like ripping bone tissue out, for example, to just like get those minerals in to do all of the enzymatic functions that the
mhm.
brain does and the body does and the endocrine system and all these things, and how much that ramps up in a stress situation. What's the conversation around like nutrition and getting good like supplementation and eating well and doing all those things to help deal with that traumatic event? Because if you broke your leg, hopefully if you were a smart person, you would be looking to maybe provide your body with the ingredients necessary for your body to recreate bone tissue and ligaments and all of these things. So yeah, I was wondering what's the talk around using nutritional practices to aid in that, because it's not going to be the only thing that's going to help you, but to aid in that process of healing.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable question. And I do want to start this out by saying, not a doctor.
Neither
But
am I. Yeah.
but I would like to just kind of focus on, I think we're all as a society going back to whole foods and recognizing how important it is to have whole foods and to stay away from things that are processed. And I think a big part of that, like let's say you did have an injury, is it gives your body a break so that you're not focusing on breaking down processed foods and other things as opposed to putting that energy towards healing, right? Like, let's say
Hmm.
you hurt your leg, right? If we're really focusing on nourishing ourselves and putting good food into our bodies. And I think like just from a straight up humanistic perspective, I feel better when I'm eating whole foods and when I'm eating things that are rich in nutrients. And I think we can all relate, like when you go out to eat or when you go out for fast food, your body just doesn't feel as great as when you're going to make like a simple chicken and broccoli dish at home. And so that would be my take. And then I would say for a concussion, I had a pretty serious concussion a little over a year ago now. And so that one was hard. And I think a lot of water really
Mm,
helped. Drinking water, I'm not the best at that, but really trying to make that more part of our life,
cheers.
and obviously getting additional help. And I seeked out like medical help and like a concussion
Yeah.
physiotherapist as well. But yeah, I think water, whole foods, and that side of things, if that answers your question for
Yeah.
nutrition.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's wonderful. We have a few like ex-hockey players from like the 70s and 80s that are just like their brains just got absolutely smashed. I feel blessed that I was born in England and not in Canada because of just the hockey environment back in those days and how those individuals would, they would recover from a concussion in 2 minutes, having a shift off the ice, and they would just go back on again.
Yeah.
And then when these individuals retired, I've interviewed a few of them on the show and at health shows, and they described it as this like deep dark depression that they would have, this like filthy rotten cloud that was just like covering
Mhm.
covering them from like their head to their neck.
Yeah.
And fortunately they found some of our supplements, and they're able to use a combination of our like mineral products, our vitamin products, and our amino acids to actually get in there and like actually help deal with the concussion. And we've got some really incredible research on being able to do that. And they describe this cloud as it becomes like lifted. And
Mm,
what I find interesting is that when they stop, some of these individuals, like once they took the products and started to feel better again and starting to get their brain back, their cognition, fatigue is disappearing, the fog is disappearing. But as soon as they stop the supplements, it comes back because it's long lasting damage that the body's got to take a long time to get over. So fortunately they recognized that, and they were smart enough to recognize that the missing piece was being able to get nutrition, and especially the minerals in our like flagship product here is, they've got chelated micronized minerals that can pass through the blood brain barrier and actually nutrate the brain in those areas that are damaged. Most supplements can't do that. And that's primarily why we have all this amazing research that other supplement companies don't have. But that's an extreme example of like a physical trauma on the brain that's just like, they've probably had 100+ concussions in their careers over 20 years. And if those individuals are able to like recover like that cognitive function, it kind of bodes well for a lot of other people who are like, coming out of a car accident or something like that. But as again, I'm not a doctor either. This is just an experience I've had working here with Truehope, but it logically makes a heck of a lot of sense that if I had damaged tissue and it was a difficult area to access like the brain, you have to be using very unique, very high quality supplements in order to be able to do that. And then the other pieces that goes along with that, whether that is breath work, meditation, being in nature, putting your body in a state where it's actually being parasympathetic, where it's actually able to like heal and repair, how valuable that would be.
yeah, absolutely. And like, especially for concussions, like being able to like sleep and not be on screens, rest is so important.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. I think there's so many people walking around with concussions that they don't even know that they have. And there are some really cool practitioners out there. There's chiropractors, there's obviously medical doctors as well, naturopaths, osteopaths, all works uniquely and specifically with concussions. And yeah, I would guess nutrition being a huge part of that for sure. Like you mentioned about trying to avoid all the other food, trying to avoid those foods that's just like fuel on a damaged fire. A damaged fire, that doesn't make any sense, but you get what I'm talking about. Let's talk about virtual counseling. So your clinic serves clients across the country virtually. Are the outcomes comparable to traditional like in-person therapy, and what are some of the biggest advantages people might not expect?
Yeah, I would say yes. I think any research, anything that I have looked into, any experiences that I've had, people very much so enjoy virtual counseling, and have the same benefits that they would in-person counseling. The only thing I will say is some people, just on a personal note, much prefer in-person counseling, and that's totally fair. And I think
Mhm.
that there's a space for that, and that's just not what we service, but I feel like there's a lot of benefits of virtual counseling, and a lot of that is kind of the ability to have your appointments from the comfort of your home. We're talking about some things that are quite traumatic often in
Mhm.
counseling. You're working through, you're processing things, and being able to kind of curl up on your couch in your pajamas or feel that sense of comfort is really helpful. So I think that's a big one. The other piece is we live in a pretty fast-paced society, so you don't have to leave. You get to have your appointments at home. And the fact that we're across Canada, virtual counseling clinic also has created this space where people have access to clinicians who specialize in different areas who they might not otherwise have access to
Mm.
where they live. The other piece to that is that you're not going to run into your counselor, provided they don't live in the same city as you, right? You kind of have that autonomy and separation. So I do think that there's a lot of benefits of virtual counseling. And
Mhm.
yeah, I feel from my experience and from what I've seen, people have benefited greatly from it.
That's great. Yeah, I can see a lot of pros and a lot of cons to like being able to do either.
Yeah.
I think for me, like one would be a con for the virtual would be like I feel like I if I was somebody who was really nervous about therapy. I mean, I'm a man. I don't think I wouldn't say I'm nervous, but like, I'm an egotistical, self-centered male some of the time. And I would think I don't need any help from anyone. I'm absolutely fine. Even though those statements would qualify me that I would require support and help. But anyway, I would feel like it would be a lot more challenging for me to like bail if I was going to go in person. Do you know what I mean? Like it would be easier for me if it was like an online thing to not show up for myself or my therapist. What do you think?
That's interesting. I've never thought of that approach because I feel like the opposite with virtual, that it makes it a lot easier to show up and that you're more likely to do it because you don't,
Mm,
I guess, have to worry about like seeing other people in the waiting room or
yeah.
going through that process if you are kind of nervous about going into counseling and what that can be like. So not something I thought about, but it's a new perspective.
That's just me, but I also think that it would be way more beneficial for other people, for everybody, that if you're in like the most comfortable environment you could be in, which is probably like, at home on your own sofa with your own blanket, not having to like dress up nicely or whatever that means for like going out into town to go to a therapy center. Like I get it. Like it's going to be different.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about the future of mental health. Now you're somebody, your organization, that they're bridging, research, counseling, and I guess entrepreneurship in a really cool way, where you're able to give access to this to therapists, about to access people across the country, which is great. Where do you see mental health care leading over the next decade? Do you think we're moving toward a more integrated model that recognizes the connection between the brain, the body, and emotional well-being?
Absolutely. I would say that a couple things, and again, I always like to just preface that I might be a little biased because I am in the field, but I do think that mental health care and mental health support has become a lot more common, a lot more talked about, a lot more recognized. And I think with that comes this openness for help and support.
Mhm.
And yes, to your point, the connection between mental health, physical well being, nutrition, all of those elements I think are so important and so critical, and again, becoming a lot more common.
Yeah, I love that. I think that so we spoke earlier in the show about like the change in our cultural evolution
Mhm.
and how it's go go go. I think it's a massive challenge for a lot of people to have somebody in their lives that they can actually talk to and be listened to. I think that the requirement for all different types of therapists is necessary because of that fact, and it's so easy to just jump on your phone and feel somewhat connected because you've got social media and all this stuff, but in actual fact you're viciously isolating yourself. I think for a lot of people are, if they're using that as like a mechanism for you know dopamine hits and the comfortability of being kind of like connected to the outside world, but you're at home on your phone. I think that's a big challenge for a lot of people. And when you actually have somebody that can just take that minute to like listen to you, because so many engagements these days, it's, you know, I talk, and then when you're talking, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say rather than actually listening to you. I think that we've the natural response to that is like people like yourself, because we don't have that as much as we do as we used to, you know, when the world was a lot quieter and we'd have that option. So I moved to Canada to study nutrition, and I did a 3.5 year degree in nutrition on Vancouver Island. And when I started working with, I primarily worked with like 30 to 40-year-old men who weren't getting away with the same diet they had in their 20s and needed some support there, and a bit of guidance, a little bit of a kick up the butt, you know. And a lot of those clients, they just never really been like listened to for such a long time. And my initial intake is like 2 hours. It goes on forever. For that's what they say anyway. It goes on very, very long time. I want to leave as much space as possible for all sorts of questions. And by the end of it, you know, I was asking kind of how the session was for them. And a lot of people just like, they've never had like someone to talk to properly about like more vulnerable things. You know, you don't necessarily want to be super vulnerable with your family, because you're supposed to be the strong one, and you're not supposed to, you know, let up. Everything's fine. You can go and keep going. And, you know, friends have got their own busy lives, and you don't want to burden them with your problems. But it just goes to show the value of, I think, being empathetic and understanding to people. And if you've got the capability, you've got the time, you've got the patience and the skill set to be able to just like sit with somebody and like actually ask them how they're doing, and just like listen, whether it's they're talking about this, that, or the other, just holding that space and being an active listener is just like, can just go such a long way to helping people get better.
Absolutely. And I think I love that you brought up men's mental health, because I also think, to specifically speak to that, it's becoming a lot more common that men are seeking out support and seeking out counseling, and having that recognition of like, we're also emotional beings, and we do need support, and we need some help in different areas. So with you there.
Yeah, that's cool. We're associated with an organization called Heads Up Guys, which is a really amazing like men's organization, and I don't always shout them out, so I'm going to do that. It's headsupguys.org. They've got some really cool like self check-ins, like they've got like a depression check-in that you can go do. You can learn more about your symptoms. They've got a therapist directory, and, you know, we've worked with the doctors and the therapists that started that up. They're working out of UBC, and yeah, really amazing resource for guys, and they're doing some really cool stuff. So I thought I'd just give them a shout out as well, because they're very close to where you are, Stephanie.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm just going to finish up with a closing question here, and to maybe offer some ideas and some motivation, some inspiration for maybe people who might be struggling now. So, now, if someone is listening today and they're feeling hopeless, or they believe that they're broken beyond repair, what message would you leave with them today?
I think the one thing that I'll leave off with is, in giving people hope, is that suicide does not end suffering, but it eliminates the possibility of things ever getting better. And that's a Marsha Linehan quote. And so give yourself a chance to see something different, and to experience something different, and to embrace something different. And that would be what I will leave off with.
Beautiful. Lovely, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Can you let people know where they can learn more about your work and connect with you?
Absolutely. So the company is called Virtual Connect, and we offer counseling services across Canada. You're welcome to look us up, virtualconnect.ca, or send me an email at info@virtualconnect.ca. We have free 15-minute consultations or discovery calls with myself. You're welcome to book in and learn more about counseling and the process. Even if you're not ready to start, I'm happy to answer any questions of what that might look like.
Magnificent. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, that is it for this episode of Truehope Cast, the official podcast of Truehope Canada. For more information about some of the things we've spoken about, I'll leave links in the show notes so you can connect with Stephanie. I'll leave a link in there for Heads Up Guys as well. If you got a second, you can leave us a review on iTunes and a star review on Spotify. But that is it. We'll see you next week.